The setting of nightmares. In the depths of medieval castles, concealed beneath the cold stone floor of dimly lit chambers, lay a secret horror. Hidden from prying eyes, these dark and dank chambers were anything but accidental. They were purposefully designed to be a prelude to hell itself, a place to crush the human spirit before the first drop of sweat fell and long before the first cut was made. Built into the foundations of many churches and castles, these chambers were damp, pitch black, and just cold enough to make anyone who entered them think twice about what they were about to do. Of course, this was also an incredibly effective way to ensure that the prisoners wouldn't die of natural causes before their appointed torturers arrived. But while your average prisoner would find themselves praying to God for a quick death, there were those who wanted to use this time to plot their escape. To counter this, some cells were built with angled ceilings. That way, any prisoner tall enough to stand up would hit his head. There were also tiny holes near the ceiling for light and air, but they were just big enough for a mouse to crawl through. So, if the prisoner tried to climb out, he'd stick his neck out and have an easy target to hang him from. Fear as the first weapon. Once inside the torture chamber, darkness was the first weapon wielded against the prisoner. Shackled and alone, they were forced to listen to the screams of others as their own fears grew. Then the door creaked open, and in the dim glow of a torch, they saw the instruments of their pending agony. Sometimes the instruments of torture were placed near the entrance to the chamber in plain view. At other times, the torturer paraded around the room, making sure the prisoner had a clear view of the upcoming carnage. After all, the goal here was to make sure that the prisoner knew exactly what was about to happen to him. If he didn't know, he might get a chance to wet himself or soil himself somehow. And since dignity was everything to a medieval man, this was unbearable. Of course, the fear instilled in the prisoner at this point was another important tool for the torturer. He wanted the person to be afraid, and that fear would often be enough to break the prisoner. Tools of agony. Let us put to rest once and for all that nonsense you've heard about the rack not being real, or that the breaking wheel was only in fairy tales. The rack, strappado, thumbscrews, and breaking wheel were all very real tools of torture. What's more, they were precision devices built to last a long time so that the suffering could be prolonged. This was because medieval torturers did not want to kill the prisoner right away. They wanted to make him suffer, and they wanted to make him suffer for a long time. This means that many prisoners spent hours on the rack as the torturers either gave them breaks, or maybe even took turns. And that is not something anyone can survive. Professionals of pain. And now let's put to rest another myth, the notion that the torturers were just random guards who volunteered for the job because they liked hurting people. That idea is not only romantic, but it is also dead wrong. In fact, being a torturer was an official position, meaning that the torturer was usually not a guard at all. He was, for example, a doctor or someone with a similar status. These people studied the body and knew exactly how far they could go before causing death. The thing is, death was not what they were aiming for most of the time. That is why they were professionals, because they needed to know what they were doing. If a peasant happened to be a torturer, then that person would probably just end up killing the prisoner instead of inflicting prolonged suffering. Sanctioned by power, but why would a king, a court, or even the church need to sanction the act of torture? Aren't we all supposed to be against hurting people like that? Well, the thing is, back in the medieval period, torture was seen as a completely normal and sanctioned practice. It was even considered moral in many cases, such as when the church believed it was necessary to extract a confession from someone accused of heresy. The king, too, saw torture as his duty, a necessary evil to uphold justice. And besides, it was also a show of power, a reminder to the population that the king had the upper hand and that nobody was safe from his wrath. Also, the king didn't always need to sanction torture. Sometimes the nobles would do it on their own. A lord could be furious at a peasant for insulting him or his family, and the lord would use torture to punish the person. Worse than Hollywood, when we watch movies about medieval torture, we usually see things like Iron Maidens and people being burned alive. But the truth was much worse and far more efficient. Medieval torturers usually relied on ropes, fire, and iron. Ropes were used to hang people, but not always in the way you might imagine. For example, the garrote was a simple but effective device used for silencing those who opposed the crown. A noose was placed around the victim's neck and then tightened slowly until they suffocated. Another popular method was to hang someone upside down by their feet. This caused blood to pool in the victim's head, leading to nosebleeds and eventually unconsciousness. Fire was another tool used in medieval torture. People were burned alive as a form of capital punishment, but they were also burned with hot oil or hot sand to make them confess. Hot oil was sometimes thrown into a person's face, leaving them blinded and disfigured. Meanwhile, hot sand was thrown onto a person's chest, burning their flesh and causing them to scream in agony. As for iron, it was used for all sorts of purposes, from branding people with hot irons to forcing them to drink boiling water or wine. One of the most painful methods involved inserting red-hot poker fun through the urethra and anus. Needless to say, there is nothing Hollywood can come up with that is worse than what actually happened during medieval torture. No escape. Now, some of you are probably thinking that if you were sent to a medieval torture chamber, you would remain strong and hold out as long as you could, hoping that the torturers would eventually lose interest in you and let you go. Sorry to burst your bubble, but that is not how things worked back then. Even the strongest knights, the bravest monks, and the most loyal rebels would break within minutes, and they weren't even offered a choice. You see, the whole point of the torture chamber was to humiliate the prisoner, to strip them of their dignity and make them beg for mercy. In order to achieve this, the torturers would take turns inflicting pain on the prisoner, but they would also take turns watching him endure the ordeal. Therefore, even if one torturer was sympathetic to the prisoner and decided to stop, there would be plenty of other people ready to inflict more pain on him. As a result, the prisoner would end up confessing whether he knew the answer to the charges against him or not. The truth did not matter. What mattered was that the authorities got what they wanted, a confession, the true horror. Now you're probably wondering, if the confession was the ultimate goal, then why would anyone survive a torture session? Well, the truth is that survival had nothing to do with the prisoner's strength, bravery, or innocence. It was all about luck. The whole process was meant to be the punishment. Therefore, the prisoner would experience true horror not when he was tortured, but when he was waiting to be taken out of the cell and sent to the gallows or wherever else he was going to be executed. It was the feeling of helplessness, of uncertainty, and of hopelessness that was the worst part of the ordeal. Time inside the torture chamber seemed to stretch endlessly, making the experience even more terrifying. The prisoner couldn't tell how long he'd been there or how much longer he'd have to endure, which added to his overall sense of dread and despair. All in all, it was not the physical pain of the torture itself that was the worst part, but rather the psychological toll it took on the prisoner's mind and soul. Did you enjoy this video? Tell us in the comments below. And don't forget to like it before you go, subscribe to the channel, and catch you next time.